father, uncle, grandfather, Bernard Fleming, or as I called him, Big B. Summarizing his life into a few words is an impossible task. He was so highly respected, such a great man. Giving a eulogy for a man who lived 99 years gives me plenty of material to work with. Many of you know how much I loved and respected my father-in-law, so this eulogy becomes my opportunity to brag about what a great man he was and what a huge impact he had on everyone's life, especially mine. He grew up in the Hungry Hill section of Springfield during the Depression. Nobody had anything. Many of the families were on public assistance, not the Flemings. Bernie's dad wouldn't have it. He was mostly raised by his maternal grandmother because his mother worked, but there's no doubt that he got many of his values for honesty and hard work from his dad, who worked as an engineer on the railroad. Bernie grew up playing ball with his buddies and often told us that the ball was usually wrapped up in tape and that most of the kids didn't have a glove, so they shared or they did without. He loved to tell us how he snuck into the movies, played with his friends, and roasted potatoes in the fire. This was life in the 30s. They were poor, but they were happy. He grew up knowing Rabbit Moranville and Eddie Shore. He knew everyone in Springfield, and they all knew him. If he needed a ride home, he had a friend who was a cop who would pick him up. It was like his own version of Uber. When World War II broke out, he tried to enlist in the Army, but his mother stopped him. She had lost a brother in World War I. He was gassed, and she didn't also want to lose his son to this war. Despite his mother's concerns, the Department of Defense drafted Bernie into the Army, and he was shipped off to North Africa. He served in the 45th Infantry Division, 157th Regiment, 3rd Battalion, Headquarters Company. It was a Thunderbird. Dad's unit saw more days in action than any other unit in the war. Now, it's going to give a detailed explanation of his wartime service, but for the sake of brevity, I'll just give the highlights. Dad and his unit fought the Nazis in Salerno, Anzio, and eventually liberating Rome, invaded southern France, and eventually into Germany. He took part in intense fighting, particularly in Anzio in southern France. Most of Dad's beloved 3rd Battalion was wiped out in Anzio. His survival was nothing short of a miracle. The Germans had the Allied forces pinned down within a mile or so of the beach for over 6 months. 7,000 Allied troops gave their lives on that beach, with over 43,000 injured. Dad described to me what you don't learn from books. Their feet were cold and wet. Many of them had trench foot. They were usually tired. They were close to starving. It's at this point I could tell you how they caught a chicken and had the Italian ladies cook it up for him and his friends. Unfortunately, Bernie got sick at the odor of real food. He had been living on K rations. So I'd like to tell you about Dad's Bronze Star in his words. So this comes from the book Sparks by Imogene Buchner. This took place in Riepesweiler, France. I was Staff Sergeant of the 3rd Squad, Headquarter Anti-Tank Platoon. We were sent in to attack as riflemen in an attempt to get through to the trap companies. After we ran over several enemy machine gun positions, I found what was left of my squad. They were being fired on from all sides. I found out later that the order had been given to withdraw and reorganize. The order was never relayed to me. I moved the 5 men that were left of my squad to a ditch where 2 or 3 other men from another squad joined us in the ditch. 2 of the men volunteered to make a break for our lines. One was killed by machine gun fire, and the other was wounded in the legs. I went out and I brought him back to the ditch. I then went myself to get help. He was awarded the Bronze Star for his actions in Riepesweiler. He took huge risks to save his men. He never forgot that man that he sent out who was killed. They made it to Munich and were given orders to liberate Dachau concentration camp. Bernie and his men were ordered to protect the gate, not to let anyone in. His lieutenant asked him if he wanted to go over with him to look in the boxcars that were outside the camp. They opened the boxcar door and saw the car loaded with dead bodies, Jews mostly. He just couldn't understand how people could be so evil to inflict that kind of hatred on one another. He was disgusted that the people in the town of Dachau pretended not to know that there were people being killed in the nearby camp. I know seeing those bodies in the boxcar sickened him. He didn't talk about it, but it bothered him. The war was almost over, but before Dad and his unit, the war was almost over, but before he left, Dad and his unit was sent to Nuremberg to secure the area. Nuremberg was where Hitler had the big rallies. He took the hat from a captured Nazi officer and managed to capture some Nazi flags, which he sent home. As a few of you might already know, his mother gave the Nazi flags out to the neighbors. When Dad came home, he was upset, but he loved his mother and wouldn't say anything to her. A little anecdote is that Dad didn't smoke or drink, so he traded cigarettes to the other soldiers for extra coffee. As you can imagine, that made him a very popular guy. He loved telling us that. There's little doubt that Dad's faith in God and good luck carried him along in the war and brought him safely home. After the war, Dad opened the Yellow Pages to look for a job and found a couple of nice Jewish boys, the Hettengers, and he became an apprentice electrician. He loved the Hettengers and he loved his work. In time, he became a master electrician. Along the way, he was set up on a blind date and met the love of his life, Dorothy Lyons. Bernie and Dot were married and were together for over 70 years. He really loved her. She was his life and he was a devoted husband. In time, children came along, first Jim, then Jennifer, Jean, and then finally Jolene. Now I skipped the part about how they got their first apartment or how they bought their first house. A few of you may know the story and may have heard it before, so if you want to know how Big B's bank buddy helped him get the house, you got to speak to Jean or Jennifer or Jolene or Jim. They know the story. You've heard it many times. He watched out for family. When his brother died, he became the stand-in for nieces and nephews. He watched out for Jamie, John, Bill, and Kathy Fleming. He talked about taking everyone to the circus. He mentioned that John called him Dad, and he was completely okay with that. He also served as mentor to Gilbert, Jeffrey, Mark, Michael, and Karen Johnson. He was proud of their successes and bragged about them often. Dad and Mom provided a home for Elaine and treated her like a daughter. To them, it wasn't a big deal. It was simply the right thing to do. He loved and cared for them. Dad loved coaching Little League, and he was so proud that he coached the B team to a couple of championships. They had to beat the A team to do so. He brought the kids for ice cream after the games, win or lose. He told us many stories about coaching, and it was a great opportunity for him to help young kids with their skills, but more importantly, he taught them about fair play. He was not a big talker, he was more leadership by example. He spoke often about family vacations in Connecticut at the beach in Niantic area. He loved the beach. This led Mom and Dad to retire to Cape Cod. Dad loved to walk the beach on the Cape and thought it would be great to live there, so they built 236 Compass Circle, or as my girls would call it, Cape Cod. Dad loved living here in Hyannis. He and Mom stayed active. He played golf, first at Holly Ridge, then the fairgrounds and the other courses around the Cape. He worked for Brewers Electric, which he enjoyed. He really learned his way around the Cape. Dad was a troubleshooter, otherwise known as the big gun you bring in when the regular electricians couldn't solve a problem. Later, after he stopped working as an electrician, he volunteered at the food pantry. He really enjoyed that work. It was a way for him to give back. He and Mom went to church every Sunday, and afterwards they would go to the gourmet brunch, 4 pieces of French toast, and became friendly with the owner, Joe Codalesa. After Joe passed away, Dad enjoyed getting the king's treatment from Joe's son, John. You can tell what kind of person Joe was by seeing the kindness and respect that John showed Dad. Dad and Mom traveled the country to Thunderbird reunions. They went to Orlando and Oklahoma City, Myrtle Beach, and Denver. Dad was a proud Thunderbird. And Dot was a great partner, supporting him and making the trips so Dad could be reunited with the other men who served as he had. Dad is mentioned in several books, The Rock of Anzio, and more recently, The Liberator by Alex Kershaw. Dad and Mom were special invitees to the dedication of the World War II Memorial and the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. Dad and Mom were also special guests in Washington at the Day of Remembrance and attended a speech in the Capitol Rotunda given by General David Petraeus. That trip was very special for him. Now I'll skip the story about how they bought their first house on Cape Cod, or found the grocery store, ate at Urano's, or found the dump. Okay, the year is 1988, and I had my own love story, having met Dad's daughter, Jolene. I came to the Cape to meet my future in-laws and expected the guillotine. The first time I met Bernie and Dot was to tell them that Jolene and I were getting married, and I was Jewish. I thought I would be facing a firing squad. Instead, I found a dear couple who loved their daughter. Before I end, I will remind everybody about a couple more things. First, I almost killed him the first time we played golf. I sliced my shot on the 15th hole at Holly Ridge. Big B was in a sand trap on the left side of the green. I should have picked up my ball, but I gave it a whack with my 9-iron, and the ball went way up in the air over the trees. All I saw was a white flash. It was Big B going down. I was mortified. He was holding his head, and all he said was, "Let's go." He decided that he would tell Dorothy and Jolene that he was hit by a stray ball from another golfer and not by me. Why did he back me up? I never asked him. He loved to laugh and came out the next day with a hard hat on. Eventually, I had to admit it was a joke. Christmas at the Flemings was a culture shock for me. I didn't grow up with it. The house looked like Santa's workshop. It was fake snow and holiday scenes everywhere. At the Fleming house, Cape Cod, the living room was filled with gifts. I do love the time that there was a gift for Daddy. So Bernie opened the gift, and it was a nice leather briefcase. Obviously not for him. He had to make the adjustment that there were now 2 daddies in the family. Christmas was wonderful for Mom and Dad and seeing our girls at the holidays. Christmas meant a lot to Dad, so it's fitting in a way that he passed away just before the holidays, as his passing has brought us all together. This is what he always wanted. A few years ago, Jolene and I made the decision that we would start coming down to Hyannis every weekend to see Mom and Dad. So Dad and I would go to have lunch every Saturday, and this is for several years. At first, we went to different places around the Cape, but then we settled on Baxter's. Now, if Dad loved golf, he loved going to Baxter's even more. Sitting on the deck, looking at boats, everything else. Eventually, I talked him into a lobster roll, which was his favorite. He would sit there for hours, taking in the sun, looking at boats, watching the ferries. He loved it, and so did I. We both understood that this time together was special. Our conversation was natural, not forced. We talked about everything and nothing. I lost my spot. We never rushed home. We stayed as long as possible, but sometimes we drove around Hyannis and just looked at houses and Hyannis Port and the water. I wish that those days never ended. One funny thing I can tell you is receiving a phone call from Dad that he's watching the Red Sox and the broadcast was in Spanish. I'd go down to the Cape and fix the TV on the settings on his TV, and the next week the same thing would happen. I couldn't figure out how he changed the settings on the remote. Gene told me that he would sit there for hours watching the game in Spanish. So what kind of person was Bernard Fleming, our dear father, papa, grandpa, great-grandfather, uncle, and friend? He was a devout Catholic who never forced his beliefs on anyone else. He was honest, forthright, brave, humble, fair, compassionate, and good. He was a real-life, honest-to-God hero. He could communicate with a look. Oftentimes he would smirk and just shake his head. You knew what that meant. He didn't have to say anything. Bernard Fleming was the kind of man that people liked and respected. You could count on him. had broad shoulders. He was our protector from his time in the war until his final days. Nothing would happen to you when he was around. He liked people and they liked him back. He was modest to a fault. He never ever bragged particularly about the war. He loved to laugh, he had a great sense of humor, and I loved being around him. He loved his family and he wanted you to do the same. For sure, he wanted his family to stay close after he was gone. It's the Christmas season, you're all here, and he would have loved that. Very simply, he was the greatest person I've ever known. The world needs more Big Bs. Unfortunately, they made only one. I'm just so lucky to have known him.
Good job, Bob.